Isaiah Thomas. No, not that one. The one that gets all the short jokes made about him. Yeah, that one. This guy has had arguably one of the most up and down roller coaster type careers in NBA history, both financially and in terms of his playing experience, as I've outlined in the past in what is probably the best video that I've ever done on this channel. But today I wanted to talk about Thomas's career as a whole up to this point in 2020. Starting from when he was first drafted, when basically nobody thought much of him, up until now when he finds himself without a team in the middle of the season. So why did nobody want him back then, and why does nobody want him now? Okay, so going back to Thomas's college career, he was really good at Washington. He was an all-conference player all 3 seasons and decided to leave after his junior year. Now, was that a smart move? Probably not. He probably could have used the extra year in college to further develop, but he wanted to go to the pros, and he was very clearly a talented scorer and playmaker as well, even though he obviously had limited size. And going into the draft, it looked like he was probably going to be a second-round pick. He was ranked 39th overall by Bleacher Report and 49th overall by ESPN, and he ended up going 60th, the last pick in the 2011 draft. And so I guess this is kind of the first point in which you could honestly say that nobody wanted Isaiah Thomas. So why was that? Well, a lot of the things here are pretty obvious, right? He's generously listed at 5'9". This is before the NBA went back and fixed all their player heights. He's probably not even 5'9", so that's obviously an issue. He wasn't a great defender, nor was he ever going to be even a league average one, just simply because of his physical limitations. And even though he was a really good scorer, he was more of a scorer than he was a passer in college. And so he was always going to be this specialty type player, right? So maybe he would end up having a role in the NBA, but it didn't look all that promising because of all these limitations, which is why he ended up going as the last pick in the entire draft, basically as close to an undrafted player as you can possibly get without actually being. And at that point, that's pretty much all there was to why nobody really wanted him at the time of the draft. There's more context around that scenario now in 2020, but for right now, back then, that's basically all it was about. Pretty immediately, he became a really solid scoring option in Sacramento. He averaged over 25 minutes per game in his first season, and by his third year, he really had kind of, found his role within the league. He was playing pretty good minutes for a Kings team. He was averaging over 20 points per game. The problem was they really weren't all that excited about paying him. They'd only won, in the mid-20s in games, and they didn't really see him as a true long-term piece, and certainly not someone that they wanted to invest all this money in. It was more of like a good stats, bad team guy, right? Putting up a ton of points on a team that just wasn't very good. So in that offseason in 2014, they ended up sign and trading him to the Phoenix Suns to be part of this weird 3-point guard experiment thing with him and Eric Bledsoe and Goran Dragic. And that lasted about as long as you would think that it would. He only played 46 games with the team before being traded to Boston. So now here we are, less than 4 or 5 years into Isaiah Thomas's career. He was the last player picked in the 2011 draft. He was successful as a scorer, but had now been traded by 2 different teams and ended up in Boston, and nobody really knew what this guy's role was going to be there. And it ended up being, honestly, one of the best trades of the entire decade there for at least a year or two. And so he gets to Boston and he finishes out the season pretty strong with them. Then the next year he has a career year. He plays in all 82 games, looks like a legit scorer, looks like someone that can be really good for them, and was one of the feel-good stories of that season. But the following year, in the 2016-17 season, that's when things kind of blew up for Isaiah Thomas. He was one of the top scorers in the entire league. He was an all-NBA caliber guy, made second team all-NBA, and became one of the stories really of that entire season because of how good he was, because of how good of a contract he was on, because of how smart it made the Celtics look to trade for this guy when a couple of teams had basically said that they didn't really want him. And suddenly he was one of the more valuable players in the entire league, and certainly in the Eastern Conference, right? And then he, gets into the playoffs. He's struggling a little bit with injuries. He's still really good, but he's got this nagging hip injury that he decides to play through. Then there's the tragedy of him losing his sister in a car crash as the playoffs rolled around. And then he became a playoff hero because he had multiple really good playoff performances. He was playing through tragedy. He's playing through the pain of this hip injury and decided to push off the surgery. And they ultimately were bounced out of the playoffs that year. But he really solidified himself as a real Boston sports hero there for that 2016-17 season, and most specifically for what he did in the playoffs and everything that he fought through for that team. And unfortunately for him, the team did not reciprocate the loyalty that he had showed them by playing through this tragedy and by playing through injury, because they traded him that offseason for Kyrie Irving, among other pieces. So now here he is in Cleveland. He's been traded by a handful of teams. He's coming off of a second-team All-NBA appearance, and it's kind of just one of those question marks of like, where does his career go from here? Because it was clear that he was put in a really good situation to be successful in Boston. Tons of opportunity to score. Brad Stevens set up the offense pretty much around him because he was one of the true playmakers that they had on the roster. He was a perfect fit in Boston, and now it was time to see if it was going to work elsewhere, right? He had all these opportunities there, and honestly, some people saw him as a potential one-for-one replacement for Kyrie Irving. Like I said, All-NBA second-team guy the year before, one of the league's leading scorers, and yes, the Cavs were losing Kyrie, but once Isaiah Thomas came back and was healthy, he was going to be able to replace a lot of the scoring that Kyrie provided. And obviously, that did not end up happening. The situation in Cleveland was not great at the time, and he honestly showed up at the worst possible time because there was all this turmoil around the team. He didn't quite fit in the way that he'd hoped that he would. He clearly wasn't the same coming back from the hip injury, and he lasted half a season and was traded to the Lakers. And he finished out that season, and now it was finally time for this guy to get a new contract, right? And it was time for a guy that was second-team All-NBA just a year and a half earlier to get his big contract, right? To get his big deal, the one big deal that he was going to get in his career. And at that point, his reputation had suffered so much that the market just wasn't there. Like, this was a guy that unfortunately just had the worst possible timing. He was loyal to the Celtics, played through the injury. The injury really screwed him up. He came back, didn't have the same level of quickness even when he did come back, and just wasn't the same player. And so from there, from the Lakers, he ended up signing a free agency deal in Denver. That didn't work out. Then he went to Washington. Now he's been traded to the Clippers and released. And now he finds himself without a team. And this is just a crazy career, right? Like, this is a guy that was the 60th pick in the draft and pretty much immediately became a really nice quality NBA scorer for a couple of teams, but a couple of teams that didn't want him. And then as soon as the Celtics saw an opportunity to upgrade at the position, they took advantage of it. And then he moved around all these different teams. And now here we are in 2020, and he's just sitting around waiting on an offer that, in all honesty, might not ever show up. And so what's the deal here, right? Like, how can a guy fall from grace this quickly? Why does nobody want him now? Well, a lot of the stuff from the beginning of his career still qualifies. Still not a very good defender at all. Still someone that is undersized, and still someone that has a very clear and specific skill set, right? He's going to score, he's going to play make, but he's going to need a good amount of opportunities to score, and he's not necessarily at this point in his career going to be all that efficient, right? He's an ideal coming off the bench, you surround him with good defenders, he scores and play makes off the bench for you type of guy. But in the last couple of teams that he's been on, he just hasn't been able to fill that role as effectively as they would hope. And there's just other guys that they wanted to give that opportunity to more, right? But it's not just that. It's the injury stuff. It's the hip injury that he's recovered from, but like I said, it's sapped some of the quickness that he used to have. He's older now. He's kind of gotten a bad rap for the Cleveland situation, how that all went down, and some people see him as a negative in the locker room based off how everything went down there, which in my opinion is a little bit unfair. And so now here we are in 2020, and nobody really wants Isaiah Thomas. And the other part of this too is kind of the Brad Stevens effect. And this has happened to a handful of players where they play in Boston, they play in Brad Stevens' system, and they're playing really well, and then they go elsewhere, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't translate, right? Like, for a minute, it happened to Jay Crowder when he went to Cleveland. He's recovered his career. Avery Bradley was the same way when he went to Detroit and then to the Clippers, and now with the Lakers, just isn't the same level of player that he was in Boston. And there's other context to that, age, injuries, things like that. But there is definitely this thing where you can look at a guy's career and be like, okay, they were really good in Boston, but there's just no way they're going to be that good with us just because of the way that Brad Stevens can elevate players, specifically, role players and underutilized guys on previous teams. And so at this point, Isaiah Thomas is just kind of old news, right? Like, people kind of know what he's about, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he's played his last NBA game and you see highlights of him playing in China or wherever, some other league, and he doesn't really have that much of a role in the NBA anymore. And it's really sad. And like I said in that previous video that I feel like is one of the best that I've ever made, I've covered kind of the whole tragedy of his situation, not just, what happened with his sister and how he fought through that, but the injury stuff and the loyalty that the Celtics did not show to him that he showed to the team by pushing through everything that he was going through. And it's something that people have talked about potentially coming back to haunt them with, future relations with their players. That hasn't necessarily come to fruition, but I do think that it's something that needs to be mentioned and needs to be talked about, how poorly he was treated by Boston and how much he clearly loved playing for them, and they just immediately shipped him out in exchange for Kyrie Irving. From a basketball standpoint, it makes complete sense, and I have no issue with it there. But from a people standpoint, I mean, they did not treat him the way that they should have. And unfortunately, to a large extent at least, it kind of derailed his entire career. Like, I think this was a guy that definitely still had a future in the league, and he made those decisions himself to play through the injury and to play through everything that he did, and then the Celtics made their own decision that was what was best for them, and that makes complete sense. But I think if he never goes through the hip injury thing, he's at the very least a more productive player than he's been for the last couple of seasons, and maybe, still has a job at this point here now in 2020 when he's just kind of sitting around on the couch. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.